I have kept a tally book for 31 years. Cattle in, cattle out. Money owed, money paid. Rain in the spring and the weeks without it. I am the kind of man who trusts a number more than a face, because a number has never once lied to me, and I have known a great many faces that did. So when I tell you that the whole town of Cedar Wells came together one morning to do a cruel thing, you can believe I counted them. 41 grown men and women standing in the road outside a girl's door. 41. And not one of them had done anything wrong, not by their own reckoning. They had only been robbed, and a robbed man wants someone to make pay. The girl they came for had stolen nothing. She was 19. Her crime was her last name. There is a number I never wrote down, and I think about it more than any other. It is the number of men, out of those 41, who broke from the crowd that morning and stood beside her. 1. He came down off the mountain to do it, and he was the last man on earth any of us expected. This is the story of that winter. I have told it badly to myself 100 times. Let me try just once to tell it true. The thing I remember first is the sound her tea kettle made, hitting the dirt. It was a cheap tin kettle, dented on one side, and when Lyle Prute's boy pitched it out the doorway, it bounced twice and rolled to a stop against my boot. There was still water in it. I watched it darken the dust in a little fan, and for some reason that is the part that stuck in me. Not the shouting, not the broken window glass later, but that small spreading stain of wasted water in a country where water was the whole reason we'd all been ruined. You have to understand about the water. A year and a half before, a man named Mordecai Vane had ridden into Cedar Wells in a coat the color of a bruise and a hat too good for the rest of him. He had charts. He had a surveyor's eye, or said he did, and a way of talking that made you feel slow for asking questions. There was an aquifer under our valley, he told us, a great cold lake of it, sleeping in the rocks since before the Lord made Adam. All it wanted was wells. Deep ones with the right iron casing and the right engine pumps, more than any one rancher could afford alone. So we would do it together. The Cedar Wells Artesian Company, shares at $40, and a man could buy as many as his hope could stretch to. I bought 6. I'm not going to pretend I was wiser than my neighbors. I had buried my wife the winter before, and there was money I'd set aside for a thing she'd wanted, a real glass window in the front room, so she could watch the weather come over the ridge without the cold getting in. She never got it. After she was gone, the money just sat in the coffee tin, accusing me, and when Vane talked about cold, sweet water rising up out of the ground forever, I thought, well, she would have liked a garden. So I bought 6 shares with a dead woman's window. The wells came in dry, or salt. One of them, out past the Hadley place, came in with water so foul it killed 2 of Hadley's steers that drank from the runoff. By the time anyone thought to check Vane's surveyor credentials against the territory office, Vane was 4 days gone, and so was $11,000 of Cedar Wells money, and so was the future most of us had bought a piece of. What he left behind was his daughter. Della Vane had come to town quiet, the way a shadow comes into a room before the man casting it. Nobody had paid her much mind while the money was good. She kept her father's accounts in a careful hand, sold the shares when he was too busy being charming to do it himself, and lived with him in the 2 rooms over the old assay office. After he ran, she did not run. That was the thing none of us could forgive, I think, though we dressed our reasons up in finer clothes. She stayed. As if she had nothing to be ashamed of. As if she meant to stand there in the middle of our anger and wait it out. For a while the town only froze her. Prute's Mercantile wouldn't sell to her. The church ladies turned their backs in a slow, practiced way, like a field of sunflowers following something that wasn't the sun. Children threw clods at her window and were not whipped for it. She bore all of it without a sound, which I came to learn was not the same thing as bearing it easily. There is a kind of stillness that costs more than screaming. But a frozen town thaws into something worse, and that morning in the road was the thaw. It had started, I gathered, with a rumor that Vane had written to her, that she knew where he was, that she had a portion of the money sewn into a mattress and was only waiting for the talk to die down before she rode off to join him, fat and laughing. There wasn't a thread of proof. There didn't need to be. Prout stood on a wagon tongue with his face the color of raw liver, and said the words that a crowd had been waiting all season to hear somebody say first. That she'd had her warning, that decent people had a right to be free of thieves' blood, and that she was leaving Cedar Wells today, on her own legs or dragged. It made no difference to him. I was at the back. I want that known, and I am ashamed of it both at once. I was at the back, with my hat in my hands, counting heads the way I count everything, telling myself I was only there to see, that seeing wasn't the same as doing. A man can stand at the back of a cruel thing for a long time and call himself a witness. Della came to the door. She'd heard the kettle hit the dirt and she came out to gather her things, and the sight of her quieted them for a moment, not from mercy, but the way men quiet when the thing they've been hunting finally steps into the open. She was small, plainer than the rumors made her, which surprised me. Rumor likes its villains beautiful. Her hair was pinned up the way her mother might have taught her before her mother died, and there was flour on her sleeve from bread she'd been baking that none of us would ever have let her sell. She looked at the kettle. She looked at the crowd. And she bent, slow, and picked the kettle up out of the dirt and held it against herself like it was a child. And that small, foolish dignity was somehow the worst thing I had seen in a year of bad things. "I have your father's ledgers," she said. It wasn't what anyone expected. The crowd shifted. "Every dollar," she said. Her voice was low, but it carried, and it did not shake, which I think frightened them more than tears would have. "Every name, every share, every dollar he took. I kept the books. I didn't know what they meant, but I kept them honest because that was my work and I was proud of it." She swallowed. There, one crack, quick, smoothed over. "I can't give you the money. I don't have the money. But I can give you the truth of where it went, and there are things in those books that would surprise some of you." She looked at Prout when she said the last part. I did not understand it then. I filed it away. I am a filer of things, but I did not understand it. What I understood was that Prout's face went from liver to ash and back, and that he said, fast and loud, that a swindler's daughter would say anything, that the books were forgeries, that they'd burn them and her with them if she didn't get gone. And the crowd, which had wavered, found its feet again on the strength of his certainty. It was Cobb who threw the first real thing, a whiskey bottle half full. It went past Della's head and broke the window behind her, the one she'd been baking under, and the breaking glass sounded enormous in the cold morning, and something in the crowd let go all at once. They surged. I have seen a herd surge like that at a snake or a gunshot, 100 separate animals becoming one stupid, frightened beast. I dropped my hat. I think I shouted. I know I started forward finally, a year too late, knowing I was one old man and would be no use at all. And then the dog came down the street. I knew the dog before I knew the man. There was only one dog like that in the country, a great gray brindle thing, part wolf if you believed Cobb and all wolf if you believed the children, and it came down the middle of the road at an easy lope and stopped between Della and the crowd and stood there. It didn't growl. It didn't have to. It just stood and looked at us, with eyes the color of creek ice, and the crowd beast came apart back into 41 separate, uncertain people. Then Calder rode in behind it. I should tell you what Calder was to us. I have been putting it off because it is hard to say plainly. He lived up in the high timber, on the shoulder of the mountain we called Old Woman, and he had lived there longer than I'd been ranching. He trapped and he guided and he hunted, and he came down to town maybe 6 times a year, and when he came the town arranged itself around him without anyone deciding to. Men who would argue with the preacher and cheat the tax man and spit at the territorial marshal went quiet and respectful when Calder spoke. Part of it was that he'd brought half the valley through the hard winter 8 years back, when the snow came early and the passes closed, and we'd have starved or frozen if a man who knew the mountain hadn't known where the elk yarded up and how to reach them. He'd fed people who later wouldn't meet his eye in church. Because the other part, The part nobody said but everybody carried was that Calder had lived years among the Apache before any of us came to the valley, had a wife among them, lost her, and the child she was carrying, to a fever the white doctors at the fort wouldn't ride out to treat. He came back from that a quiet man with a quiet dog and a hardness in him like a riverbed under low water, and the valley respected him and feared him, and never once let him forget that he was, to them, a man who had stood on the wrong side of a line they'd drawn in their own heads. He knew what it was to be hated for who he'd loved. I didn't think about that morning. I thought about it a great deal later. He got down off his horse slow because everything Calder did was slow, the slowness of a man who had decided long ago that hurry was how you got killed. He looked at the broken window. He looked at the bottle glass. He looked at Della holding her dented kettle, and I watched something move behind his face that I couldn't name. Then he looked at all of us, and he said the only words he said in that whole road, and he said them quiet. "You're a brave town," he said, "40 against a girl." Nobody answered. Prout opened his mouth and Calder turned his head and looked at him, and Prout closed it again. Calder walked to Della. He didn't touch her. He took his hat off, which I had never once seen him do for any man, and he said something to her too low for the rest of us to hear, and whatever it was, she nodded. He picked up the trunk that Prout's boy had thrown into the road, the one with her dead mother's things in it. I would learn, and he carried it to his pack horse and lashed it on, and he did all of it with his back to 41 armed and angry people as though they were so much weather. "You're taking her," Prout said. It came out strangled. "You're taking the swindler's girl up your mountain, after what her blood did to this town." Calder finished his knot, he checked it, then he turned around. "I am," he said, "and the first man who rides up to do anything about it had best send a letter home first." He let that sit. Then softer, in a way that was somehow far worse. "You all wanted somebody to pay for your money, and you couldn't find the man who took it, so you went and found the smallest person you could reach. I have seen that done before. I have seen what it makes of the people who do it." He looked at the church, at the schoolhouse, at the well in the square that had no aquifer beneath it after all. "Go home. Be ashamed if you've got it in you. And if you don't," the gray dog rose, unhurried, "teach your dogs to stay off my mountain." He put Della up behind him on the horse. She didn't look back at the town. She looked at the broken window once, at the bread cooling on the sill that none of us would eat and now no one would, and then she faced the mountain. I picked my hat up out of the dirt. The kettle she dropped again in the climbing was still there. I bent and got it, and I don't know why, except that a year of standing at the back of things had finally come due in me, and a man has to start somewhere, and a tin kettle is a small enough place to start. The crowd melted off in 2s and 3s, not talking, the way men leave a thing they don't want to have been part of. Prout stood in the road a while looking up at the timber where horse and girl and dog were already going small and dark against the snow line. His face wasn't angry anymore. I've thought about his face a great deal. It wasn't the face of a man who'd been defied. It was the face of a man who'd been frightened by what a girl said she had in a ledger book. I went home and I opened my tally book, and on a clean page I wrote the date, and under it I wrote, "Calder came down, took the Vane girl up. The town should hang its head." And then, because I am honest in my book if nowhere else, I wrote one line more, and it is the truest thing I put down all that year. I did nothing until it was nearly done. The kettle I set on my own shelf. I didn't know yet that I would be carrying it back up the mountain before the snow was deep. I didn't know much of anything yet. That is the trouble with the start of a thing. You are too busy being in it to see its shape, and by the time you can see its shape, you have already become one of the people inside it. The first snow that meant it came 9 days later, and I rode up Old Woman's Shoulder with a dead woman's kettle in my saddlebag, and no good reason I'd have admitted to. I told myself it was the heifer. Calder had brought a sick yearling through for me 2 springs back, knew animals better than the so-called vet down in Halloran, and I had a heifer off her feed I could plausibly want a second eye on. I even loaded her in a borrowed trailer to make the lie hold up. But a man who keeps a tally book learns to read his own columns, and the truth was in the margin. I had not been able to sleep right since the morning in the road. There was a thing I owed, and I did not know its size, and I have never in my life been able to abide a debt I couldn't number. Calder's place sat in a pocket of timber where a cold creek came out of the rocks, and it was not what the town imagined. The town imagined a hovel, a hermit's den, the lair where a half-wild man took a stolen girl. What I found was a cabin built tight and true, a smokehouse, a pole barn with 3 horses and a milk goat, racks of stretched hides, a garden gone to bed under straw for the winter, and everything in its place with the particular order of a man who lived where carelessness killed you. The gray dog met me at the tree line and walked me in like an escort. Didn't growl, counted me, I think. We understood each other. Della was at the woodpile. I almost didn't know her. In 9 days she'd changed the way you change when nobody is grinding you down anymore. She stood straighter, and there was color in her, and she was splitting kindling with a hatchet in a steady, competent rhythm that told me she'd done it before, somewhere, in a life before her father's coat and charts. She saw me and went still, and the old wariness came down over her face like a shudder, and that hurt more than I expected. "I brought your kettle," I said. It was the stupidest possible thing to say. I said it anyway, and I held it out, dent and all. She looked at it a long moment. Then she set the hatchet down and came and took it, and she turned it over in her hands the way Calder had checked his knots, like a thing that mattered, and when she looked up her eyes were wet and furious at being wet. "My mother boiled medicine in this," she said. "When I had the croup, she'd sing to keep me from clawing my throat." She wiped her face hard with her sleeve. Everybody in that town watched it get thrown in the dirt and laughed. "Why did you bring it back?" Wasn't a question I had an answer to. So I told her the truth, which I was getting into the bad habit of that year. "Because I bought 6 shares off your father with money I'd kept for my dead wife," I said, "and I hated him so much I could taste it, and then I stood in that road and watched 40 people decide you were him, and I didn't say a word, and I can't carry that, so I brought the kettle." I shrugged, an old man's shrug, no dignity in it. It was the only piece of it I could reach. She studied me. Whatever she saw, she decided to believe it. She set the kettle on the chopping block, careful, and said, "He'll want you to stay for dinner. He pretends he doesn't like company, but he cooks too much." That was how I came to sit at Calder's table, and over the weeks that followed to sit there often, and to learn the things I am going to tell you now, some from him in his few words, more from Della, most from watching, which is the thing I am best at and the thing I am most ashamed of. I learned that Calder had not taken her the way the town said. He'd offered her a choice in the road, his mountain, or money enough to reach the railhead and go anywhere a stage would carry her. She'd chosen the mountain. When I asked her why, much later, she said, "Because running would have made me what they already think I am. And because he was the first person in a year who looked at me and didn't see my father." She paused. "And because I had nowhere else, and I'm not too proud to say it. Pride's a thing you can only afford with money." I learned why the town respected Calder in full. Not just the hard winter. He'd buried his wife and unborn child on a slope above the cabin, and he'd never once spoken her name to a white man. And the only reason I knew it at all was that one evening Della, who had it from him, told it to me by the fire while he was out checking the trapline, told it gentle, like handing me something that could break. The fort doctor wouldn't ride. The valley folk wouldn't help him bury an Apache woman in their churchyard. So he buried her himself on his own ground, and he came down out of the high country a man who had learned exactly what a respectable community will and won't do, and to whom, and the knowing of it had set in him like cement. When he stood in the road and called Cedar Wells a brave town, he wasn't guessing. He'd kept the same tally I keep, only in his bones instead of a book. And I learned the thing that frightened Prout. It was the ledgers. Della had told the truth in the road. She had her father's books, everyone, the real accounts that Vane had been too vain to keep himself. And one cold afternoon, with Calder gone 2 days on the line and the snow shut down soft and total around the cabin, she got them out and showed me, because she had decided I was the kind of man who counted things and might see what she couldn't. There were two sets. One was the company's books, the public reckoning, shares sold, money in, money spent on casing and engines that never came. The other was a private ledger in Vane's own cramped hand, and it was a record of bribes, of payments made to certain men in Cedar Wells to vouch for the scheme, to stand up in the meeting and say they'd seen the survey, seen the water reports, put their own good names behind the lie so that their neighbors would trust it. Vane hadn't worked Cedar Wells alone. He'd bought himself local mouths, and the largest single payment in that book, $300, was made to a man recorded only by his initials, but recorded also with a note in the margin. Mercantile handles the doubters. LP. Lyle Prude had not been Vane's victim. He'd been Vane's salesman. He'd taken $300 to talk his own neighbors into ruin, and then, when Vane ran and the town went looking for blood, he'd been the loudest voice pointing it at a 19-year-old girl. Of course he had. The girl had the books. The girl could end him. The whole vicious campaign to drive her out of the country that I'd watched and not understood hadn't been about justice for the town at all. It had been a man trying to chase the only witness over the horizon before she learned how to read her own father's marginalia. I didn't understand it until last week, Della said. Her voice was very flat, the way it gets when a person is holding something heavy and level so it won't spill. I thought the initials were a supplier. Then Calder said LP and she stopped. What do I do with it, Mr. Wick? If I show the town, half of them won't believe a swindler's daughter over their own merchant. And the ones who do believe, she looked at me. She'd done the arithmetic faster than I had. The ones who believe might decide it's easier to make the book disappear than to face that they were fooled twice. And the surest way to make a book disappear is to make the person holding it disappear with it. She was right. God help me. She was 19 and snowed in on a mountain with a man the valley feared and an old rancher she'd known a month, and she had reasoned out her own danger more clearly than any of us. I sat there with the two ledgers open on the table between us and the snow ticking at the window, and I felt the cold of it climb up through the floor and into me. Does Calder know? I asked. I haven't told him. She closed the private book, gentle the way she did everything, the way her mother must have taught her. Because I know what he'll want to do, and it'll cost him his mountain and maybe his neck, and he's already paid enough for other people's sins. She looked at the door, at the white world beyond it where he was somewhere on the line in the falling dark. I won't let him pay for mine. That was her morally heavy thing, and I want you to see it clearly because the town never did. She had in her hands the proof of her own innocence and another man's guilt. She could have used it to buy back her name, and the chief reason she hesitated was that using it would put the one person who'd been kind to her in danger. She would rather stay the swindler's daughter, hated and snowed in, than spend Calder's safety to clear herself. I have known a great many respectable people in my life. I have not known 3 of them with that in them. What I did next I am not proud of and not ashamed of either. I have simply never been sure it was right. I told her to give me the private ledger. I'd take it down to the territorial seat at Halloran, past Prude's reach, to the federal marshal who'd had a paper out on Vane for a year and would dearly want what was in those pages. It would take the matter out of Cedar Wells's crooked hands entirely. It would take it out of Prude's reach. And it would mean that if anything happened to Della on this mountain, the book that damned him would already be gone where he couldn't follow it, which was, I told her, the best protection she had. A dead witness is no use to anyone, but a witness whose evidence is already filed is a witness it's pointless to harm. She thought about it for the length of time it takes a log to settle in a fire. Then she gave me the book. I rode out the next morning with the snow breaking and $300 of recorded sin in my saddlebag, where the kettle had ridden up. The gray dog walked me to the tree line again. Della stood at the woodpile with the hatchet, small against the timber, and she lifted one hand, and I lifted mine, and I thought, writing down, that the worst was past now. That the book was the thing, that getting it to the marshal would unwind the whole tangle, that I'd be back up in a week with the law behind me, and we'd set Cedar Wells's lie on its head. I am a man who trusts numbers because faces lie. I had forgotten that a calendar is only numbers, and that it can lie worst of all about how much time a thing will give you. I made Halloran in 2 days. The marshal was 3 counties west on a hanging and not expected back inside the month. I left the book sealed with his deputy, a careful young man who understood what he was holding, and got a receipt for it, signed and dated, because I do not let a thing of value pass out of my hands without a number on it. Then I started back up the valley with the receipt in my coat, easier in my mind than I'd been since the road. I smelled the smoke before I crested the last ridge. Not wood smoke. There is a difference, and a rancher knows it the way he knows his own heartbeat, and I put my spurs to a tired horse and went up that last grade with my heart climbing into my throat. Down in Cedar Wells, far below and behind me, I would learn that Prude had spent the week I was gone telling anyone who'd listen that the Vane girl had been seen burning papers, that she meant to destroy the only record of the town's money, that something had to be done before the proof was gone for good. He'd built another crowd, a smaller one. Smaller crowds are braver sometimes because every man in them feels seen. And while I'd been riding down with the very book they claimed she meant to burn, 6 men had ridden up old woman's shoulder in the snow. I came over the ridge into Calder's pocket of timber, and there was the cabin, and there was the smokehouse burning, the smaller building, the racks of winter meat going up in a column of greasy black, and there was the gray dog standing in the dooryard with its hackles up and blood on its muzzle that was not its own, and there were tracks, a confusion of churned-up bloody snow, going off into the timber in a hard line. And there was Della in the snow by the woodpile, on her knees, with Calder's head in her lap and her hands pressed dark and shaking against his side. And she was not crying. She was past crying. She was saying his name over and over in a low, steady voice like a woman boiling medicine in a tin kettle, and singing to keep a child from clawing its own throat. He was not dead. I want to put that first, because Della's voice saying his name has stayed in my ears for the rest of my life, and I won't make you wait the way she had to. He was not dead, but he was close, with a knife wound under his ribs that had missed the lung by the width of the truth, and the cold that had nearly killed him in the open snow was the only thing slowing the bleeding enough to keep him. I got down off my horse and into the worst hour of my life. Della had already done what could be done, packed the wound with something from the medicine she kept, the knowledge of it her own, not borrowed. A competence I'd stopped being surprised by, and between us we got him inside, onto the bed by the fire, and I did what she told me with my old man's clumsy hands while she worked, and the gray dog lay across the doorway with its ruined muzzle on its paws and would not be moved. She told me what had happened in pieces, while she worked, because the telling kept her hands steady. 6 men. Prude not among them. Prude was the sort who builds the fire and stands well back from it. They'd come up bold in daylight, sure of themselves, sure that a swindler's girl and a half-wild hermit were small enough to handle. They'd set the smokehouse alight first, to draw Calder out, and it had worked, and they'd meant, I think, to burn him out and take her down to a town that wanted to put her on trial for arson she'd never committed. But Calder had come out of that cabin not like a man defending a building, like a man who had already, once, watched a community decide his loved ones weren't worth saving, and had sworn on a grave above the timber that it would not happen twice. He'd put 2 of them down before the third got him with a knife, and the dog had taken a piece out of a 4th, and the upshot was that 6 brave men had ridden up a mountain to deal with a girl, and ridden back down carrying their own wounded, and a horror none of them had been prepared for. That the thing they'd been told was a swindler's whelp had fought for her like family, and that the man the whole valley respected had been willing to die in his own dooryard rather than hand her over. You cannot tell yourself a comfortable story about a man who bleeds for someone. It ruins the story. That is why they ran. He lived. I'll say it again because I like saying it. He lived. It took the rest of that winter and a fever that twice we thought would finish what the knife started, and Della at his side through every hour of it, and the medicine she knew and the medicine I rode to Halloran to buy, and the deputy's quiet word in the right federal ears. But he lived. And here is the reversal, the thing I have turned over more nights than I can count, because life so seldom hands you a thing this neat, and I half distrust it even as I tell it. The marshal came back from his hanging to find a sealed ledger and a sworn receipt waiting on his desk, and the ledger named names, and one of those names ran a mercantile in Cedar Wells. When a federal marshal rides into a small town asking after a man, the town's loyalty to that man evaporates like spit on a stove. The same neighbors who'd stood in the road behind Lyle Prout found, suddenly, that they'd always had their doubts about him. Funny how that works. They remembered all at once and out loud how hard he'd pushed the shares, how he'd handled the doubters, how loud he'd been about the girl. Prout was arrested on a morning in early spring, and he did not go quietly, and the thing he shouted as they took him, that he'd only done what the whole town wanted, that they were all of them guilty, that he was just the one fool honest enough to say it out loud, was, I think, the single truest sentence ever spoken in Cedar Wells, and they hated him for it more than for the theft. The town had wanted a swindler's blood to pay for its ruin. It got one. He'd been ringing up its groceries the whole time. What it did to Cedar Wells, having to look at that, I won't pretend they all became good. People mostly don't. But a town that has been made to see itself clearly is at least a quieter town for a while, and shame, in the right dose, can pass for decency at a distance. The church ladies sent food up the mountain in the spring, by way of a boy who left it at the tree line and ran, and Della took it in without comment and sent the baskets back clean. Cobb, who'd thrown the bottle, rode up alone one day and stood in the dooryard a long time with his hat in his hands, and finally said he was sorry, to her and to Calder both. And Calder, who was up by then and thin as a fence rail, looked at him and said, "I know it," which was not forgiveness exactly, but was more than Cobb had earned, and Cobb seemed to know it and rode off lighter. They never did fully take her back, those people. I want to be honest, because she was. You do not undo a year of a town deciding what you are with one winter of being proved wrong. The decision has set too hard by then, and people would sooner be wrong forever than admit the size of the thing they did. She would always be, to most of Cedar Wells, the swindler's daughter, with a question mark folded into the name now where before there'd been only a verdict. That was the best the town had in it. I have made my peace with that being most towns' best. But she had stopped needing the town. That was the thing. I asked her once, that spring, sitting on Calder's step, while he mended a snowshoe with hands that had got their strength back, whether she'd thought about leaving now that her name was as clear as it would ever get. The railhead. Anywhere a stage would carry her. The life her father's daughter might have had in a place where nobody knew the name Vane. She watched Calder work for a while before she answered. The gray dog, healed, with a notch in its lip it would carry to the grave, lay in the new sun with its eyes half shut. "My father gave people a thing they wanted to hear," she said finally, and took everything they had for it and rode off and left me to stand in the road and answer for him. My whole life he taught me that the way you get on in the world is to be charming and to never, ever stay long enough to be held to account. She picked at a splinter in the step. "Up here, nobody's charming. Calder doesn't say 3 words he doesn't mean. The dog can't lie. The mountain'll kill you if you cheat it, and it doesn't care who your father was." She looked up at me, and there was something settled in her face that her father had never once worn. I spent 19 years running with a man who could talk his way out of anything. I'd rather spend the rest of it with one who can't talk his way out of a wet afternoon. I know exactly what he is. There's nothing he's selling me. Do you understand how restful that is, Mr. Wick? To be somewhere where no one is selling you anything. I said I thought I did. I'm not sure I did, not all the way. But I'm an old man and I've been sold a great many things in my life, including by a man in a bruise-colored coat with a chart of water that wasn't there, and the older I get the more I think she'd put her hand on the realest thing in the valley. They married in no church with no town the next fall. I was there. The deputy from Halloran was there, having become a friend by way of the ledger. The preacher would not come up the mountain, and Calder would not have asked him, and so they stood up by the grave above the timber where his first wife and the child lay, because Della said it was right that she be made welcome by the people already there, and the wind came over the ridge cold and clean, and that was the whole of it. I have been to grander weddings. I have never been to a truer one. I keep the tally book still. There is a page near the back where, over that long winter and the spring after, I wrote down what each thing cost: 6 shares, a window never bought, a smokehouse burned, a knife under the ribs, a dog's lip, a town's good opinion of itself. I am a man who needs to number a debt before he can rest under it. But there is one line on that page that has no figure beside it, and I have decided to leave it blank, because some accounts cannot be carried in a tally book, and a wise man stops pretending they can. The thing Calder did, coming down off that mountain into a crowd of 40 for a girl he didn't know, I wrote. And then nothing. No number. Some things you cannot reckon. You can only stand at the back of the road where they happen and be ashamed and learn, and try the next time to be the one who steps forward instead of the one who watches. I rode down off Old Woman that fall with the wedding behind me and the first hard frost in the air, and partway down I stopped my horse and looked back the way you do at a thing you don't expect to see unchanged again. The cabin smoke went up straight in the still cold, the two of them small in the dooryard, the dog between them, the grave above in the dark timber, and her among the welcomed now. I have told you this story badly, the way I always do, leaving out the parts I can't bear and putting in too much of myself. But I have told it, and I have left out the last thing on purpose, the way Della left the food baskets, the way Calder left a name, the way the mountain leaves you to figure your own footing in the dark, because some endings aren't mine to spell out, and you have got this far, and I think by now you can carry the rest of it yourself.